Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ray Berghouse in another AMC podcast recording session. And today we have with us a most extraordinary gentleman. His name is Wally Storey. I think pretty much everybody in motor racing knows about Wally Storey, or at least something about Wally Storey, because he's had such a storied career, no pun intended, that he's just one of those names that everybody seems to have come across at some point in time.
Yeah, g'day, Ray. How you doing?
Remarkably well for an old man. Let me start by saying this. Most people who've heard of you and think of you as an engineer, the guy who built the Holden racing team up in the 1990s from literally a bare shed. What made you go to the Holden as a team? Where was that starting point?
The Holden racing team thing, it started the year before. If you remember in 1989, they had Larry running two cars, I think, for Sandown and Bathurst and Adelaide, maybe 3 races, right? And they sort of weren't happy with Adelaide, with Larry, which is, you need to know the whole story. I think they were a bit unfair on LP, to be honest. But anyway, they decided they wanted to upscale a bit. And they approached me at Adelaide Grand Prix. I was working with Crompton with his Formula Holden, and they came to me and asked me to hang around till Monday and have a bit of a meeting with John Harvey and have a discussion about running the 2 cars in Wellington and Pukekohe, like 2 races in New Zealand with 2 cars. And I sort of talked to him and questioned halves, which probably he's not technical type guy. He wouldn't know, but he had enough non-answers to discourage him if he wanted to do a bad job. So I declined the offer. I decided I wouldn't do the job because I didn't need to make my first attempt at that level a shitter, which, I had that all written all over it because it was such a short time and they were fighting Larry a bit. I didn't know what they had and they didn't know what they had. So you're just likely to get there and find you got, cars and nothing, no wheels or no clutches or, God knows. So for those reasons, I declined that offer at that time. Next year again, Tom sent Winnie out to start it, and he wanted to start with an Australian team. He didn't really want to bring a pile of POMs out, if you know what I mean, because for a start, Tom didn't want him raping his shade over there, and was Holden, it was Australian, and Winnie was pretty strong about building a team up with Australians, basically. And he knew Crompton, and Crompton thought, I might be the right bloke for the job. And I wasn't really that keen to rush off down there, to be honest, to Melbourne, because all my family, my business, everything in Sydney. But, the wife actually said, look, you think you're pretty good at this. Here's your chance to find out, isn't it? Like we can start again with another business in Sydney. It's not the end of the world. It's not like if you throw it down the drain, you never get one back, The business is really you, and people will come, build it and they will come, I think it's the same. She said, if you start another business somewhere, they'll go again. It might be a hiccup, but it won't be a raging failure. And to be fair to the missus, she's always backed me up pretty hard, so it's pretty good that way.
Well, that sort of gets us really, I jumped into the middle of your story, really, because let's go back. Because that's a very, very interesting zone in your career. But let's go back to the beginning. Tell us how you got involved in motor racing in the very first place.
The fellow that I run around with, historic car now, Bruce Connolly, we've been friends, forever and ever, basically, since high school. So that's how long it goes back. So, and Bruce had an older brother, Lindsay, who I went to school with. And Bruce, being the little brother, he wanted to do where the action was where Lindsay and I were. So we tagged along. So we had the 3 Musketeers a lot of the time. And they had a cousin, Paul, and he had a friend, Rodney Hamilton. He was into cars. And I knew nothing about cars. Like nobody in my family was mechanical. But these blokes got me going on it a bit, and I was a bit interested. We went to Warwick Farm and had a bit of a look, and this is not bad. And, you get to know all the stars of the day, And we actually eventually went to a few of the Tasman races and stuff, and I was pretty impressed with the blokes driving. I stood in the pouring rain one day watching Jochen Rindt drive.
1969.
When this thing, look, he drove this Formula One car like Ari Varden, and I was thinking, wow, there is a level of this that, you don't see very often, and this is it, So I sort of understood driving, and I was sort of starting to drive cars myself at that stage. I was a very late starter in driving cars. So that association going to the races, we used to go to Warwick Farm and Oran Park, and eventually to Amaroo as well. And Elwyn did his apprenticeship at the Sydney County Council, and he said his father, and his father was a very good mentor. He was a very clever guy, very common sense bloke. He preached common sense like very few people do. He was very good. I learned a lot out of Ted. To bear in mind, I had no father, right? So my natural father bailed when I was 18 months old, so I went for a long time with really no father figure at all. So I found Ted Bickley was really good. He was, and Bruce Conley's father was very good too. Bede, he was very good. So I got a lot of guidance father-wise out of those blokes, more than I got out of anyone at home, really, because my mother just worked like crazy because she was the only one making money. Anyway, we keep digressing. But
that's us. Carry on.
Yeah. So, yeah, from going to watching races, we decided we'd like to get a bit closer and put our 2 bobs worth in. So we actually become scrutineers. We knew bugger all, but at least we could help, stand next to the car. That if you were impounding a car, the competitor didn't know whether you knew anything or not. So, it was a bit of a game of bluff, but at least we got to look at the cars and see how they were built, have a talk to the guys around them and that sort of stuff. And through the county council, John O'Brien was Elwyn's friend at the county council, and he knew Dave Moore. And John O'Brien was building a clubman car, and down at Dave's where he started at Lappish Avenue in Ashfield in Sydney. And from there, we watched him build this car, and we thought, well, it's not so bad. We can do this. We teach ourselves to weld, and we can teach ourselves to machine. And, part of my trade was machining, but they didn't really teach you a lot. But fortunately, where I did my apprenticeship and was a leading hand and so forth, I had the lathe or two, so I could borrow a lathe and make bits as well. Like everybody does that when they're making race cars anyway. So we sort of grew into it. We got to know Dave, and then he's a very central figure in motor racing in Sydney at that stage. Like a lot of very clever people and a lot of very knowledgeable people came through the door, like Bruce Carey and so forth. So, you got a lot of guidance from those people. Like I remember when I started making stuff, Bruce Carey took me aside and he said, why are you spending that much time on something and doing half a job? Then you got to go back and do it again. Do it right. Don't leave anything on the table. Never die wondering. Like, make sure that you do it right the first time. Give it everything. Don't. He said, you'll look back and you can do it better. He said, but don't do half a job the first time. Do it as best as you can possibly do it, right? Which was very good advice, and it stuck with me, pretty much ever since, really. And it's been good advice, and I've given it to a lot of young blokes that I've been involved with. They've carried that story along with them as well, and that they've probably done okay out of it, I think.
I think really, that's, I guess, the mantra of all engineers, isn't it, really? I mean, you've got to not only understand how to design the thing, but how to build it, and don't build 17 versions of it, because you don't need 17. You just need the one that works.
It doesn't matter what you do. When you look back, you can always do it better. Like Elwyn and I, we actually didn't start out building Formula Fords. Dave Moore speared us onto Formula Ford because it was just starting. And he said, look, this is a coming thing. This is a no excuses category. Like, the engines are not ridiculously expensive. Like if you start getting into a Corolla engine, putting a camshaft in it, then you're continually chasing whatever breaks next, aren't you, if you start hotting up a road car that was never meant to be. And he said, this is a thing to do. And he said, it's, these things are doing lap times that would have won a Grand Prix only 5 years ago. Like, this is a fast car. And it teaches you everything. It teaches you gear ratio, springs, shock absorbers, roll bars, ride-heights, geometry, which it did. It actually was a very good lesson. Dave's advice in that area was very good. But through the process of building clubmans and explaining how you can always do it better, at one stage, John and I had 5 sets of wishbones hanging in the roof for the first Formula Ford we built. And I finally of course we can build them better. For Christ's sake, we're not going to learn anything. We don't start racing this thing. We need to learn much more than making a better front wishbone on, for shit's sake. But he's a perfectionist type guy. He is really an anal sort of bloke. Like, if you ever deal with Elwyn, when I first introduced him to my other group of friends, right, I said to him, this guy's different. And today Bruce says, I remember when you introduced Elwyn, you said he was different. He said, was exactly the right description. It's through 40 or 50 years, it's turned out to be exactly the right description. And he is. He doesn't need 400 people's company. You know what I mean? He's very happy, but he's just, when you see him do something, He's sort of mellowed a bit lately, I'd have to say, but he would never do a second-rate job. Like, he just doesn't know how to do one. And he'll do it 7 times, and you're like, we can't charge this out of one. We just can't. Do it once, it'll work, send it, So I was when we were both together at Moore Engineering when Dave moved up to Orangeville, I was the one saying, we'll go broke if you keep this up. We can't sell them 7 things. They only want one. They want one that works, and they want one they can afford. Let's get on with it, So it was one of those things that went on for a long time.
You operated on quite a lot of different cars, didn't you, in that period? I mean, you did some work on Bob Stevens' V8 Cortina sports sedan. You worked on Ray Winter's Mildred.
Yeah, I didn't. Here's an interesting story for you. If you think one time Ray was leading a Formula 2 championship race at Oran Park by quite a distance over Leo and a pile of other people, and the thing stopped. And the thing stopped because the oil tank wasn't quite right. It literally ran out of oil, pumped the oil out in the breather can. That was all. The Ray was like blazing it into the distance. And I actually ended up with that oil tank, and I modified it to put in the first race car we booked. So I didn't have an oil tank. We were building the car at the time, sort of thing, And Dave, the thing is, he was cranky with it. He threw it against the wall. I'm like, woo, calm down. So it's going to do is hold oil, Dave. I'm sure we can make this work. So I took it out the back, stuck a hose in it, had a bit of a look at it, mucked with it a bit. And, it spent its life in 002 and it went forever.
It's not amazing. It's, what was about to become a piece of scrap ended up being a part of a race car that lasted for an awful long time.
Well, Harry built the thing, and Harry's Galloway is an extremely good babby, as you know. And it was just where the oil comes back in from the engine, it spews around. And in that instance, it just happened that some of it went out the breather can. So eventually these little drops add up to a fair bit, if that makes sense. So that's what happened. It just emptied the breather can, but it wasn't a rager. If it was a 5-lapper, it wouldn't have been a problem, or a 10-lapper, it wouldn't have been a problem. It's probably a 100-mile race. That's why it ended up being a problem. Yeah, it was just the quirk of fate that he was Ray blazing off into the distance, and it just, it showed what Ray could do. Ray was an exceptionally good driver, and he was like such a laid-back guy. Like, he was not totally unassuming, Blake. Like, never beat his chest or brag or nothing like that. He was just a truck driver who could drive a race car very, very well,
That's right.
But it was a shame that he didn't get to show his wares in front of the world. But it's just that's the way life goes sometimes, isn't it,
It does indeed. Like, see, I'm thinking, just because of what you've been saying over the last few minutes, you're very much a traditional style. You're an old school style engineer. You're not a computer based engineer. You learn to do things, with your hands and with your mind. And
I'm certainly an old one anyway. There's nothing else.
Okay, well, yes, that's a common affliction these days.
It's something that's common to everybody, Ray. It gets you. There's no avoiding it.
Remember the old gag, growing old is mandatory, growing up is optional.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I haven't done the second one very well. I still go fishing.
You and I are in the second group, I'm afraid. So,
yeah, that's right.
So anyway, let's talk about, we want to get back into your career. I mean, let's jump a little bit. You drove extremely well in Formula Ford. You've driven a lot of motor cars, but we'll touch on those as we go through. Probably would the gig that you got with Frank Gardner be one of the early, say, professional appointments that you succeeded in getting?
I used to make stuff for Frank, quite a bit of stuff actually for them. I used to make it for Grice when he was up behind Amaru as well. Basically via Frank. Frank used to send everybody to me because he understood that when he got it, it worked and it was right. They had a bit of a habit, those blokes, because the races were so far apart, there wasn't very many of them. And they had a bit of a habit when they took something off that needed to do and they put on the shelf and, we'll get around to that later. And then one of the guys who used to work for them used to live near me, not far from where my workshop was. I was in, pretty much where the Olympic side is now. And he was at Strathfield, which is pretty much the other side of it, And he would turn up at this thing and say, can we have it in the morning? And I'm like,
that's normal. Exactly. You want it when?
Like, why is there an inch of dust all over it, Alex? If it's such a desperate thing. He's, we put it on the shelf. we forgot about it. And I'm like, yeah, righto. And this went on. It was becoming a habit. So I put my dirty old white overalls out, jumping the old crappy XW, XYU, rock on over to Frank, or XB, I think it was by then. I rock on over to Frank and said, listen, Frank, can you take your work somewhere else, you know? And he was really hurt. I didn't realise it was going to hurt him that badly. And he's like, what's your problem? Why that? Like, he didn't know what to think. And I said, look, these blokes they're a bit disorganised, and like, I've got a family I want to see, and every time I won't knock the work back because I respect you too much. So what I'm saying is, when you get the panic ones, can you take them somewhere else instead of me, you know? Because what happens is these blokes, Alex turns up after he's knocked off work, before I knock off work, because I'm knocking off at 7, and saying, you know, can I pick this up in the morning on my way to work? And because I make a habit of doing it, they automatically assume I'm going to keep doing it, right? So they've trained me up to this thing, and eventually I'm like, Jesus, I've had enough of this. So I just said to my friend, can you? And he was like really hurt. I was surprised how hurt he was. I was really disappointed in myself for not thinking it through a bit more, because he was very good to me with advice and stuff. Anyway, they took some work to another guy who happened to be in Greenacre of all places, right? And it was at the time that asymmetric calipers were literally just on the scene. And what you got, I think from Martin Felt, you got this AP caliper, and it had a big flat plate on it. There was no ears to bolt it on as such. They bolted differently to how they do today. They bolted on ears that extended from one side of them. Anyway, they sent them to this guy, and he fitted them up. I think about when that Leopold von Weyen fellow was driving for them, right, the Prince.
Yes.
And like Frank said to me, he said, look, I hate to do this. And no, you don't want it. I said, no, Frank, if you're stuck, I'll help you. You've been too good to me not to do that, right? He said, I really need another set of these in a hurry, right? I said, well, send me the sample so it makes life easier. So they sent them over, and I've looked at these things, and I'm like, So I ring him up, your calipers mount on the front, right? And he's like, yeah. I said, why read on asymmetric calipers? Because I've thought about this a bit, because you're forever machining pads to make them parallel again, because the front edge of the pad always digs in, and if you've only got one pad with one piston, which was very common in those days, or 2 pistons at most, and they were all the same size. Nobody ever thought of making them asymmetric until about that stage. I mean, I'd thought about it. I'm sure a lot of other people around the world had thought about it. I wouldn't have been the Lone Ranger. But nobody really made any. And I looked at these things and I said to Frank, my take on this, I would have the big pistons trailing and the small pistons leading. And he said, yeah, that's right. Like, And he's like, you're trying to tell me something, aren't you? I said, yeah, but you need to jump on your horse and come over, I'm afraid. And he's like, oh, shit. So he comes on over and he looks, and this bloke had put him back to front, right? Because he was not a motor racing guy. They just would have said, mount these calipers, right? So he did. He wouldn't have even noticed they were asymmetric, if you get my drift. So he's just made them, right? And mounted these things up. And Frank's bolted over and he's like, looked at him, he was like shattered. And he said, your fault. This is your bloody fault. I had a guy who knew what he was doing who would not have made this mistake. So you deserve to be stuck with fixing it. And he said, hang on, there's an idea. We just swap them side to side. I'm like, I thought of that already, Frank. And he's like, what are you going to tell me? I said, using verniers, you measured the hole centers, because I measured them 3/4 inch different. So one side caliper had a different hole pitch to the other. And he was like, man, he abused me for freaking sticking with this guy. He said, you deserve to fix this. It's your fault. So hang on a minute. How come your blokes turn up late in the day making me work all night? It's my fault. That's where this started, don't forget. And he was like, we all laughed, pissed ourselves laughing. He said, okay, I don't give a shit what it costs, just fix it, will you? Oh, yeah, I don't know how this is going to work, Frank. I'm going to feel well. But I'll do, you'll end up with 2 different hole pitch calipers, so you won't be able to swap them from car to car. Because they're 3/4 inch different, I'll mark the other 2 calipers 3/4 inch different and swap them over at the same time.
Gee, this is getting technical.
It was just too much. Anyway, that was probably one of the biggest things with Frank. The other thing he got me to do, which was actually a really good project, he got me to make a stainless steel turbocharger snail, like a fabricated one, for that 318.
Oh, the sports sedan, yeah.
When sports sedan was really strong, yeah, he had this idea that the big cast iron snails, one, they were heavy as all get out, which is the last thing you need in a race car. and they take too long to warm up. He said, because these things were not computerized. They were just a metered injection unit, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, very, like just a normal metering unit. And they had terrible lag, and he said, I reckon this will fix the lag a lot, you know. And he had Jimmy driving the thing, and Jimmy's, as you know, like he don't need any reputation cup up. He's one of the best we've seen. So he could drive this thing, but Frank said, like, this is not that good, you know. But anyway, I said, Frank, this is going to be a lot of money, like a lot of money. He said, yeah, no. He said, I'll do it, yeah. I'll pay you a bit at a time, Drip, so you don't have to stand out, you know. You don't have to stand the whole bill. So I made this thing. Fortunately, I had a young bloke called Kevin Weston working for me at that time. And he came from McLaren. He was a guy that was making hundreds of side pods when they were on the ground effect. You know what I mean? Like
he was making those. Yep.
He was making side pods with like something like 200 pitot tubes hanging in the bottom of them to check the suck of the depression under the side pod. A pitot tube is what measures vacuum, if you don't know. It's, you know, there's all these little tubes along the bottom face, and they could draw, from that information, they could draw a profile of where the centre of pressure was and so forth.
You know, anybody listening to this would wonder whether or not you were actually an engineer, but I think we're probably getting to the point where we know you are an engineer, definitely.
Well, it's a learned thing, isn't it? Like anybody. My young bloke's an engineer. I made him go to university. He wanted to do what I do, and I said, you won't be doing that being an electrician, son. You need to work a bit harder at uni.
Let's go back to your career as a driver for a minute. Now,
yes, yeah.
You were a pretty handy.
You off the path.
You were a very handy Formula 4 driver, and the records say that you drove a Formula Ford at Bathurst in 1988 in one of the support races against some very, very quick young fellas, and you almost won the darn thing. Now, what was that like? I mean, you'd had obviously a lot of Formula Ford races before that, and you were extremely quick. Did you ever have any? Did you ever had any desire to become a professional racing driver because you were doing a very good job in that formula?
I was sort of in the wrong era. To be honest, we'll go back to Frank Gardner for a second. Frank thought I'd be a good racing driver, like professional racing driver. He actually was working on giving me a job. At one stage, he had me G'd up for the BMW at Bathurst that Stephen Brook drove, that he managed to run in the wall with. Frank said, I got this job I'd like you to do. And then later he came back and he said, I'm sorry, I can't. Dean Wills thinks this is a good idea. It's a good idea. And if you remember back, Brookie was driving a Perrier.
Oh, for Phil Christensen.
Yes. Well, Perrier, believe it or not, is part of Coca-Cola Amatil, which was Dean Wills' own at that stage, where he was a major owner, right? So he was seeing Brookie, and Brookie, Brookie and I are good friends, and I they got a good bloke. You know, whether I'd be better, be very arguable. Brookie's very good. So that was what Frank wasn't. Like Frank said to me, so I'm sorry, but Dean Wills would want to run this bloke that they're already sponsoring. Because Christo would have put his 2 bob in, which is fair enough. That's his job, right? He was pushing the guy, and he was pushing a good guy. He wasn't pushing a donkey, so that was good. But Frank came to me and said, I'm really sorry, but Dean Wills thinks something's a good idea. It's a good idea, whether it is or it isn't, you know. And having met Dean Wills in later life, Dean was a lovely guy. So he would just take advice from other people, and it was good advice. Brookie was very good. So as much as I was a bit disappointed, really, I didn't walk around saying, gee, I could have done a better job, because Brookie was we'd driven the same car several times and we were very close. So, he did a good choice anyway, I thought. I said to Frank, look, you really got a good bloke, to be honest. Like, I can't argue with that. Like, it's not like that saddle with the donkey. And he said, no, that's okay. Then he went off and he said, I've got another thing cooking, right? He said, but it's going to take a bit of political work because it doesn't really fit locally, but then there's a car that doesn't already, so we might be in with a shot. And he was going to bring in 2 Formula Atlantic cars, like Marches, in fact, with BMW engines put in them, right? And what he was going to use as leverage, because Formula Atlantic was BDA Fords, nothing else, right? He was going to use the leverage that Willow was already running around with a Tolman with a Toyota.
That's right.
But as it turned out, a lot of the other competitors, which was a really interesting thing, because I was sort of sitting around the table listening to all these blokes saying, Frank will turn up and sing, there's some hot shot. And it'll blow us all into the weeds. And I'm sitting there thinking, I can't say a word, right? I just couldn't say anything.
Because you knew what was going on in the background.
I knew the hot shot, but you can't break that confidence. Like Frank said, do not tell anybody, right? Well, I'm pretty sure I can tell him now because Frank's not here and he ain't going to beat me up anymore. Yeah, so he had this thing going and it was very close to getting over the line, but all the current Formula Atlantic twin cam guys all jumped up, down and bleated and said, no, we don't want to get hosed by everybody else. And I thought that was a bit odd, considering they were struggling for entries anyway. But they were so paranoid about getting hosed by somebody in this BMW, this Mara thing or something. And they were like, no, that'll be terrible. I'm like, eh. And I'm sitting across the table at More Engineering listening to all these blokes because there was a gathering place. More Engineering was a gathering place for all these people, right? So by this stage, I think it was up at Orangeville, obviously, because I was at Greenacre. And I was up visiting Dave and I got to listen to all this discussion. I thought, this isn't going to get up too well.
So
and Frank said, what do you...
This is about, early 1980s, I'm guessing? Because, Formula Pacific started 81.
It would have been around about the time that the same thing as a BMW touring car happening. So it would have been, yes, early 1980s, I would have thought, yeah. 81, 82, 83, somewhere about there. Back to the Bathurst race.
Yeah, go on.
What happened there was Ivan Stibbard, I turned up at Amaroo one day, right? And I'm helping unload the car, whatever car I was working on at the time. I actually don't remember because I worked on so many. And I get called to the tower. Wally Storey, come and see Ivan Stibbard. And I'm like, Jesus, they were
what
like...
have I done?
The Gestapo, weren't they? Like we used to call them a Gestapo. Because Ivan used to rule them with an iron hand. All those officials, they went game to fart with it, asking Ivan. Anyway, I thought, Jesus, I've just started to unload a car. I haven't even talked to an official. What could I possibly done wrong? Anyway, so I wander up there. I'm like, here we go. I'm going to get a rooming here somewhere. And he says, I need a bit of advice. And I'm thinking, shit, this is big. You're asking me for advice. He said, I've actually got some sponsorship money to run a support race at Bathurst. And I'm thinking of Formula Fords because I know you blokes are very dedicated to your category. I'm like, yeah, that's good, yeah. I said, so where do I fit into it? And he said, well, I just want to know if you'll think they'll behave themselves. Yeah, no problem. And he's like, you don't want to think about that for a while. I'm like, no, I'm going to go and get a car. And he's like, well, I've driven touring cars there.
There's a whiff of money. Here I come.
Well, no, it wasn't money. It was just I'd driven touring cars several times, but because you're a co-driver or it's someone else's car, you can't really have a go, if you know what I mean. Plus, yes, I drove a lot of cars, but I wasn't super confident in a lot of them, but I was always very confident of Formula Ford because I think I drove 34 different ones over my life. 34
different Formula Fords?
Yeah, that's a few, isn't it?
Crikey. That's more than most race drivers ever conceive of.
Yeah, so, when I turn up at Bathurst, look like a hot shot. Keep in mind I'm practicing quite often 2 or 3 days a week at that stage, testing someone else's cars, either sports sedans, Formula Holdens, touring cars, or Formula Fords. Formula Fords were the common thing, but they weren't the only thing by a long way, sort of thing. So, yeah, so when I turned up there, I was driving regularly at that stage. So it wasn't a big issue. I actually drove Bruce Conley's Rolt in the first Adelaide Grand Prix because Bruce had ended, but he crapped his back because he's a motor mechanic. And if you ever watch motor mechanics, they keep using the bottom of their back as a crane to lift bits out of the engine bay and lean over.
Yes.
And invariably they give up. And I know 3 motor mechanics in our group of friends. We have quite a good group that we all keep in touch for years. And 2 of them have got pretty second-hand backs. One of them was smart enough to start getting a few employees and not doing as much mechanically himself. So he's still buggered. Like, he's just not as buggered. He had to work a long time to get to that point, but he managed to. So, yeah, and it's when Bruce was back, he said, look, I'll keep the entry. You can drive this thing. You've done a lot of work on it. We've improved it a bit, So then I needed an International B licence. So then I had to go, cap in hand to Tim Schenken to get one, which is, that's probably better imagined than spoken about how easy that'd be.
I understand completely.
So I had to front up with all these receipts. He said, you're not driving. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm driving 3 or 4 days a week sometimes, at least 2 quite often, So I sent him this massive pile of receipts I kept, or copies thereof at least, from test days I'd done, and he actually was good to me. He went ahead with it. He let me go, which, you know, technically he should not have. He had the power to override the rule. The rule is you have to race X amount, and I wasn't racing. So it was a bit of a cap in hand thing. Like I was asking for something, and, you know, you always read the rules, and there's always the override at the bottom, you know, unless in all the circumstances they see fit too. Well, I was working on that bit, you know.
Yeah, the stretch bit, yeah.
Yeah, and he was good enough to let me do it. So, you know, and in spite of the fact that I had many blues with Tim over a long period, I actually got a lot of respect for him. I thought he was very good at the job that he did, you know, the supercar job. I thought he was very good clerk, of course, myself. That'll probably get me in the poo with a shitload of blokes in pit lane, but... You know,
carry on.
That's my opinion, and I'd stick by it. I think he was very good at it.
So how did you get on in that race with the with that car?
Oh, it was a good race. There was one guy there who seemed to have an extraordinary amount of steam, and he had it from Thursday, so he was the bloke who won. But when they, well, you can cut this out or put it in, take your pick. After the race, Greg Black, who's the chief scrutineer, said to me, you know, the engine went straight, and I said, look, I'll give you that engine, point to mine if you take that one. I don't think you'll waste your time, you know. And he was like, oh. So then, lo and behold, mine gets protested, right? So he's following, I'm going to have a late night, I'll grab a couple of others, right? So he grabbed the guy who protested and the one I pointed at, right? So there's all this hullabaloo. And because I was working for Lansvale, I just had, you know, a couple of hours off to go racing Formula Fords over the weekend, you know. I was actually up there working with Lansvale guys. So anyway, about halfway through the Saturday afternoon practice, Greg Black comes over and he said, I've got a deal for you. And I'm like, oh, yeah.
Deal from the scrutineer?
He said, these blokes will pull a protest if I don't pull their engines apart. I'm like, yeah, well, the wink's as good as a nudge there, eh? And he said, what do you want to do? I said, no, Greg. As much as I appreciate you referring it to me, you're the chief scrutineer. It's not me, it's you. You're in charge. I don't know how much work you've got. He said, I've got a heap. Because at that very meeting, Walkinshaws were protesting Dix and Dix were protesting Walkinshaws. Left, right and centre about steering racks, turbos and every other thing. Because it's, you know, he said, you don't care. I said, look, obviously right now it's important to me because every race is important to me. But in the broad picture of life, we were very lucky to be here, you know. Ivan was very good to give Formula Ford a race. We do not need to make grief, right? We do not need to make fuss. We need to, you know, bow with our hands together and say thank you very much and flock off.
And get on with the job.
We've got a televised race. Not everybody gets that, you know. Like, it's very hard to get. And that actually, when I quizzed Ivan, it went back to somewhere about 1977 or 78 now. He remembered because the Formula Ford guys, we couldn't get races. Nobody would give you races, right, unless you got a sponsor. You know the routine. You've been around a couple of days. You've seen how this works.
Indeed.
And we were having Formula Ford group meetings like New South Wales guys. And one of the committee guys was a guy called Ian Granger, who, again, I still keep in contact with, right? And he said, why don't we tell them a load of shit? I mean, not quite in those words. He said, what we'll do, we'll tell them we got a sponsor, right? And whoever wins the race gets to stand up there and plead for a sponsor and say, look, we don't have a sponsor. We've lied to the promoter, but we really need a sponsor to get races, you know. So that ended up being yours truly, right? And Ivan wasn't too happy about being fed load of crap, but he was impressed by the fact that we were prepared to chip our own money in because we gave him the prize money, right? We said, here's the first instalment of prize money, but we don't want to, you know, the typical press thing, we don't want to tell everybody who the sponsor is yet, right? We need to keep it to ourselves till the day, you know. So, and there's me pleading on the national television, we need a sponsor, which didn't go that well, obviously. It looks a bit amateur these days, but it probably was a bit amateur then. But that's where we're at. We need a sponsor. And that's basically how the Coca-Cola series was born. I got a story from maybe Greg McCombie or somebody, one of the Formula V guys, that they'd actually round up Coca-Cola. And Ivan thought it was too much money for just the V guys. So if you think back to Amaroo in those days, there was always a Coke series for Formula Fords and a Coke series for Vs. And that, I think that's because Ivan took some of the money off the V guys and give it to the Formula Ford guys.
It's kind of like the Robin Hood idea, rob the rich to feed the poor.
It may be like Robin Hood, but I'm not sure that the V guys, you'd have to ask Scoop what he thinks about that one. But I'm not sure the V guys would think that was such a great idea. They could probably earn a living, the front blokes, if they got all the money. Anyway, our thing wasn't the money. Our thing was the television. We wanted televised races so we could get sponsors for our cars.
Of course.
That's how it all goes around. And we weren't getting any races that weren't televised ones. Then it went to Oran Park. They were very touch and go with you got a race. So that was, that's how it works.
I'm going to jump in here and ask you another question. These are kind of, we normally go a little bit more chronological than this, but, your memory jumps all over the place and it's fascinating to listen to. So I'm not going to...
My business would point out that I may be a bit of a waffler. if you?
Oh, no.
Undoubtedly you've seen the film The Castle. Everybody has, right?
Yes.
And you've seen the woman say, "Don't rab it on, dear." Well, my missus does that to me all the time. I don't rab it on. You do rab it on.
Oh, dear. Okay.
Like I'll be talking to someone in the car on the phone and should be given the wind-up signal.
I'll ask you a straight question. Now,
anyway, go.
Around about 1983, 84, you met a young guy whose name was Thomas Mazira.
Yes.
A Czech refugee. He could hardly speak any English. He was trying to make it in motorsport. He ended up being quite good. Now, what do you remember about Thomas? Because I remember a lot about him, and I think he's just one of the great characters of our game.
He was, what made him successful with me? He was honest. People say to me, "Why do you like motor racing?" And I say, what motor racing does, it's not about the cars for me. It's actually about the people as much as the cars, right? And that's you're going to find that puzzling considering what I do for a living, right?
Oh, no, I don't.
But the people, what you see with motor racing people is you find out who your friends are when they're hung out to dry and they've got nothing. They've got no money and they've got nothing and they're stretched to the hilt. And if they're still talking to you and they're still racing you, they're still friendly, they're good people. And anyway, I digress, but it's to do, you'll get the picture in a minute. The dots will come together, hopefully.
Like a Rorschach test.
What happened was one day these two guys wanted in a workshop in Greenacre, right? And one guy was called Rusty and the other guy was Thomas. But Thomas didn't speak English, which is why he had Rusty in tow in the first place, right? How come I'm doing the two? He can't speak English. He's the driver. Okay. And people wouldn't know this about Thomas, but he was an Olympic-level snow skier, right?
Is that right?
Thomas. Yeah, his mum and dad had a chalet in Czechoslovakia, and he was actually Olympic-type level snow skier because he grew up doing it. And he probably the minute he was born, he started plodding around on skis, see? Anyway, so he, time went by and he got this car from a guy called Chris Patterson, which was a Carlborough. And Chris was a radiologist. He did x-rays and stuff, but he did quite a good job with this car, really. If you think about, he had no equipment, he would have done it himself. And he got a professionally built engine from a guy, which was a good decision, but happened to be a bad decision because it was the wrong guy. But no big deal. Anyway, Thomas at one stage eventually needed an engine done. I did various bits on the car for them and give them a few ideas on how to, wheel them on and that sort of jam, because they knew nothing. A bit like I was when I started, Anyway, he said, "Who do I get to do the engine?" So I sent him to Wheeze, because Wheeze is, he's black and white as they come. Anyway, they took the engine up there and it was illegal in about 100 ways, right? Because it was that particular builder wasn't having a good trot at that time. He was always getting pinged for being illegal. So it was like, "What do you want to do?" And we said, get them to put the head back on it, sell it, because it'd be cheaper to buy a brand new engine in a box and build a new one. It'll be a lot better, right? So this thing's going to need, the block's been decked too far down. It's going to need sleeving. It's got all sorts of things wrong with it, right? It's going to cost so much to fix it that it's actually cheaper to build a new one, right? So these guys, he said, "Do you know these blokes?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I can have a bit of a chat to them." Anyway, yeah, so Thomas come and "What do I do with the engine?" And I said, well, the advice from the engine guy, and he wouldn't really give you this advice, but financially the best advice for you is to sell it and just build up a new one, because it's illegal. There's so many things wrong with it. And it was like, that wouldn't be right. No, it wouldn't be right, but it's going to cost you a lot of money to fix this thing otherwise, mate. And he was like, no, I'll fix it. I could not do that to somebody. That would be wrong, Okay. Which, I said to Weeze, okay, this is a decision from this guy. And he's like, wow, we need to help this guy if we can, because he's going to get chewed up and spat out 3 minutes if we don't.
This is a man who is actually honest. Good God.
Yeah. Well, no, in motor racing, there's a lot of them. Everybody thinks that it tracks shysters. It actually doesn't, in my experience. There's the odd one comes along, right?
But they don't last long.
No, that's right. They come and they go. They're a bit like leaves after a storm, but then they blow in, they blow out. But they get sorted pretty quick because nobody wants to know about them. Anyway, so he fixed the engine and off he went. And later on, Thomas was racing this Carlborough and stuff like that, and he was doing quite well. We're not winning anything because really the car wasn't quite there in a few little ways. And I wasn't working on it or anything. I was just doing bits, He couldn't afford to pay me to work on it at the time or anything. But, there was a lot about the design of the car that wasn't that good, but it was all right, But it wasn't. Formula Ford is about, as Dick would describe it, picking the fly shit out of the pepper. You need everything really right to win a race. It's, as well as drive your ring out, you need everything right because it's in those days, a grid at Amaroo, probably 25 cars would be spread by 0.8 of a second, sort of thing, a bit like supercars is now, it's very close, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, at that stage as well, this would be about 1983, 84, I'd imagine, about 83, I think. I was involved I was going to be a Van Diemen importer for a while, but I was mixed up with the guy who was advertising the cars at a price, but the price was under what's called a Section 162 of the Customs Act. In other words,
without duty.
Bingo, right. And I'm a bit of a funny guy. People would tell you I'm a bit old-fashioned. You describe me as old school, and I am. I don't handle dishonesty or misleading very well. I believe you can be dishonest just by omitting to say something
The sin of omission, yes.
I'm that much of a Boy Scout, Whereas, in normal business, that's how it works, isn't it? So I was just getting out of the Van Diemen thing, and this guy called David Hayden walked in my workshop, right? And he was a Kiwi guy, and I didn't know him from shit, And he said, you Wally Storey, introduced himself. Yeah, we got talking. And he said, I'm going to be the Reynard importer. He said, I just want to know if there's any traps you need to tell me since you're the Van Diemen importer. I said, well, funny you should say that. I'm actually not. I'm in the process of untying myself from that, but I'm not going to be. For various reasons. I didn't go in it with him. I just said, I'm not going to be. I just, I don't think it's me for various reasons, And he's like, oh, good. Oh, even better. He said, you can drive the car then. He said, I'm going to bring one of these cars and, show everybody how it goes. You can drive it. I'm like, And he said, what does mean? And I said, okay, let me explain to you this way, right? If I drive the car and it wins, everybody going to say, well, so what? Right? If you put him in most things, he would win, right? Yeah, okay. I said, what if you put in some guy that nobody thinks is any good? And he said, you got some bloke you reckon's good that nobody thinks is any good. And I said, yeah. I said, the first thing, you're racially prejudiced. And he said, what does that mean? I said, do you hate wogs? And he said, no. He said, well, Christ, I'm a Kiwi, aren't I? I said, well, that's different. You're an Anzac. It's a different thing, mate. I said,
only slightly.
He said, what's this guy? I said, this guy's Czechoslovakian. He's a really straight guy. This guy will not argue, right? He's been through the ultimate test of having to dump probably $2,000 or $3,000 of very hard-earned money he's working as a spray painter or something getting to pay for something where he could have dodged it and he didn't. He copped the chin, right? And I said that speaks a lot for that guy's character as far as I'm concerned. So, and I believe he's very good. He's in a car I don't think's good enough, but I think he is good enough, right? So I would advise you to give him a go, right? And he was like, okay. And he thought about it. He said, can I think about it? I said, yeah, go for your life. He said, this is your honest opinion. I said, well, I just knocked back a drive, didn't I? And he's like, yeah. I said, my guy's leading the championship right now. I know what a good driver looks like, mate. And I'm telling you, this guy's good. He's just not in the right car, okay? And he's like, okay. Anyway, that's where the story started. Thomas won the championship and on it went, didn't it, right? But he got, again, a bit like Ray Winter with the oil tank. He got to show his wares, didn't he?
Yes.
Whereas if he rocked along without that leg up, he was on the verge of going back to Czechoslovakia to teach people to snow ski. There, he was touch and go. Bruce Connolly, because Bruce Connolly won a championship that year, and Bruce is a bit of a social animal once he's not racing them. He actually had a bit of a barbecue, and Thomas came with Kate, his missus. And I said to Thomas, I might have a bit of a deal for you if you want to keep motor racing. And Kate's glaring at me. She's never forgiven me, I don't think. So I don't think she's Wally's biggest fan. I'll give you the tip. Anyway, and I explained it to him, and he's like, yeah. I said, well, I don't know for sure, right? When do you have to make a decision? Well, I'm supposed to be flying out next week, but I'll put it off. And then Kate does another glare. So I'm like, I've already got 17 daggers hanging out of me. Anyway, it turned out that it worked okay, didn't it? David Hayden was a really good guy, really straight shooter, did his part of the deal. Thomas obviously drove like a cat, held up his part of the deal, and it worked for Thomas through his career. It was very good. I helped him along, but he had the talent. All I did was put one block in place, didn't I? But he was on the... It probably was a turning point purely because he was on his way back to Czechoslovakia because he had to make money.
Well, most of us have to make a living somehow.
Yeah.
Look, a couple of questions for you. Let's talk about the 80s when you were mixed up and were very, very successful with Terry Shield and the Mazda RX-7s in that era when Alan Moffat had his team. They were really an unusual motor car for Australian touring car racing. I can remember when Jack Hinksman first heard about the RX-7 coming into touring car racing, and he said, if I can't sit in the back seat, it's not a touring car. And, of course, the RX-7 didn't have a back seat at all. But what do you remember about that particular period with Terry and the RX-7s? There's got to be a few stories there.
I remember the fuel injection thing really well. That was the biggest scam you've ever seen. You got to remember first, because it sounds like I'm about to shit can cams, and I actually don't. I actually think they do a pretty good job. And it's a very difficult job if you think about the area they've got to cover. And there's very few people at that stage in cams that came through my line of work to work at cams, right? They were usually car club type people that become presidents and that sort of stuff, right?
Yes.
They weren't really technical people. So that if you look at supercars now, the people in the technical department have worked in teams all their lives, up to that point. So they're very aware of how people think in the teams, and they're that kind of people. But in those days, there wasn't really very many people until Frank Lowndes came along. There was very few people that were actually genuine motor racing people that worked for cams, right? So when Alan Moffat rocks in there and says, listen, here's a cheap bottle of champagne and a good lunch, how about we run an RX-7? They were probably a bit easily talked around, is the best way of putting it, which is probably why you ended up with the thing. I don't know how they ended up, but I was never into the politics that much in those days. I know that there was a lot of, how would you say it, very liberal reading of the rule book. I would call cheating. Right?
No. It's taking advantage of loopholes within the wording of the regulations.
Okay, since you can cut this out, I'll tell you a story about RX-7, right?
We won't necessarily cut it out. Depends on how good it is.
Well, a fellow called Peter O'Neill rang me one day and he said, this when I was at Greenacre with a workshop, and he said, you got Terry Shield's Mazda there? I said, yeah, I have. And he said, can you measure the width for me? And I said, haven't you got homologation papers, these things? Because that's the homologation papers. I measured it when I pulled it to width. It's got a cam letterhead on it. And he's like, yeah, no, I want you to measure it. And I'm like, I can tell you it's 1.5 millimeters under the size, maximum size. The size plus 1%, right? That's what it is. And he's like, how do you know? I said, because they made it that way, mate. Like, this is what I do for a job, right? And he's like, oh, I said, but since you're on the phone, why do you ask two dogs? And, oh, no, I can't go into that. I said, come on. Anyway, it comes out that Alan Moffat's Mazda's like 4 inches wider, right? And I'm like, what? You think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Think about making one 4 inches wider, right? They didn't make one. They made several because TWR had them when they raced them too, right? But I only learnt that when I was at HRT. I learned that lot later in life, right? But there was all sorts of dodgy stuff went on with extra speeds in the gearbox and all that sort of jam,
I can remember we were talking some time ago to Phil Christensen. He was talking about the number of gears in an RX-7 gearbox, particularly in practice. I think it was about 1984, and there seemed to be one extra gear in certain cars than there were in other cars.
Well, yeah, not in that they weren't quite the right ones either. Terry didn't have the ultimate G Whiz one, though. There was a G Whiz one with closer ratios, and Terry couldn't afford one, right? So keep in mind, Terry had the Mazda racing box, but you could have a Hollinger, I think, or Hollinger gears in the Mazda box, which were better ratios for Bathurst. And Terry didn't have that, right? So but I do believe that the guy who's got Moffat's car now, his historic car, wants to put 6 speeds in it because that's what it had when it was raced. And he's striking a bit of difficulty because they're trying to put out that it was illegal then. It's illegal now, mate.
Yes,
anyway.
Yes, this is what is known as interpretation of history, isn't it?
Yeah, so, I actually drove, I think, Terry's car one day at Amaru. He said, have a drive at this thing and see what you think, right? And it drove like a slot car. Like, man, you've never felt a car with so much front grip, right? So I crawl under and have a bit of a look, and it's got a McPherson straight under the front. It's got the weirdest Watts-Link arrangement under the back I've ever seen because the Watts-Link rocker is on the diff, right? Well, unless you've had to get into this rubbish, you wouldn't know. But if you lower a McPherson strut car, if you lower it, imagine you lower it 20 millimetres, you effectively lower the front roll centre about 40 millimetres, depending on the geometry, give or take a couple of mil. So you lower it about twice as far, right? If you got a car with a Watts-Link mounted on the body and you've lowered it 20 mil, well, it'll take it down 20 mil. So you've gained a bit of inclination in the roll axis, so you make the car with more front grip. But usually you make a Watts-Link so it's adjustable. But when the thing's cast with a pin sticking out the front of the diff, there's nothing you can do. And when you lower the car, it hasn't gone down at all. All you've done is left the back one where it was, and the front one gone down 40 mil. But it's worse than that. If you imagine you drive like Bathurst in those days, wasn't particularly smooth, and neither were most tracks like Oran Park and that. So if you drove a car like that through undulations, so it goes through quite a bit of bump and droop travel as it drives around, the front roll centre's going up and down like a yo-yo, and the back one's literally not moving. So every time it goes down, you try and stop and brake it. It wants to swap ends, and there'll be a point somewhere if you can make the front jump up far enough, it'll actually drive okay. Well, relatively, right? So there's a lot of. So I looked under this thing at Terry's and I said, let me read the rule book. So I read the rule book, and the Watts-Link was free. As long as you had a Watts-Link, you could put a Watts-Link on it. This is pretty straightforward. So I built one on the body like they always are, like everybody would, I didn't invent anything new. Everybody with half a brain in motor racing would do that, right? So that's what I did. And it was like, and I made it adjustable as well. It was adjustable in the brackets. There's a really lovely guy who's got that car now, an historic guy, and he's very fastidious about making it, or the guy doing it for him particularly is very fastidious about making it right because they've spoken about airboxes and all sorts of shit on the car. Anyway, I made it adjustable so it gets slide up and down, and Terry is one of those blokes. He's a John Bow or a Jimmy Richards, really. He's a bloke with a gift. Yeah, he just like Ray Winter. He probably didn't get enough chance to show his wares, although Freddie Gibson obviously worked out he was pretty good. And Johnny Bow speaks very highly of him. John Bow drove with him a few times, and John said, wow, that bloke's something else. I said, yeah, you want to try being a co-driver? It makes you feel pretty inferior. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So I put a Watts-Link on this thing, and Terry's like, wow, how good's this? And I'm like, so what else do you know how to do? I'm like, I'm pretty good at most of this shit. Well, people would tell you I am. I don't know that I am, but evidence would suggest I might have half an idea. So I actually worked with him on the car, and the car drove really well. It had a lot of problems with the engine, and I made him change engine builders to Phil Alexander, and Phil fixed those problems. So when we went to Bathurst, we had a couple of engines. He actually got an engine by the Eurocars sponsorship. Part of that deal was he got a brand new, theoretically, supposedly he was going to get a brand new 13B peripheral port engine, right? Like a factory engine.
Uh-huh.
So where Terry used to be, not far from Bob Raymond, just on the other side of the river in Ryde there, we all gather around to see this engine arrive from the freight guy and wrap it, and it's sitting on a pallet, and it's strapped on the pallet with all black bloody plastic all over it. And it's, got Alan Moffat Enterprises tape all over this thing. And I'm like,
that's weird.
Yeah.
Start. Where did it come from?
He said, you don't trust anybody, do you? I said, mate, I've been mentored, as it's called these days. I've been clued up by blokes like Peter Malloy and Frank Gardner, right? I'm getting tutored by some of the best we've ever seen at this game, at this stage. And I'm telling you, they don't trust these people at all. He said, do not. So why don't we just pull the pants off this thing and have a look inside, It's brand new. I'm like, no, Terry. Just Terry's like, he's as honest as they come. So he makes a mistake of assuming everybody else is, right?
Mm-hmm.
A mistake I used to make for a long time, but I've sort of got over it. Mark Scaife recently described me as the most cynical bloke he's ever met. Which
that's a good definition.
I took it as a compliment, actually. I thought that was pretty right. I couldn't argue with it. I'd say he's probably right. Yeah. Anyway, so we take this thing apart, pull the pants off, and it's full of gold dust. It's buggered. The engine's buggered, see. They're like, what are we going to do now? So Terry rings the Eurocars guy, and the Eurocar, in those days, RX-7s were like gold. They couldn't get enough to sell. They were selling like hotcakes, probably thanks to the Moff, in fact. So he wasn't going to make waves. He just said, look, just fix it. I'll pay to get it fixed, but I just won't make waves with Mazda. I just can't. He said, I'll never get another bloody Mazda to sell. He said, I might get another engine, but that's all I'll get. He said, I'd prefer to go about the other way. So he was obviously pretty wise. He knew the system okay, I suppose. I didn't like it because I'm into the kill 'em, But he was probably a lot wiser bloke than me. So he was a lot wiser guy than I would be, because I was going to hang him. But we got it fixed. We sent it to Phil Alexander. He fixed, put it together, and we raced on that engine. It was really good. We qualified on one of Phil's engines, and it was actually quite good. We diffed it, living daylights out. Like, people said, wow, you're pretty close to Moff. Yeah, we were. But we diffed it down to buggery, because the answer to Bathurst in those days wasn't, in fact, although the straight was a lot longer, the answer to Bathurst was actually getting up the hill. It actually takes a lot longer to go up the hill.
Oh, that's always been the case.
Exactly.
Going up the hill, it's all about going up the hill.
Everybody raves about Conrod Straight. It's not about Conrod Straight. It's about going up Mountain Straight. Good exit on a mountain straight and going up the hill, and then a good exit out of
Griffins to Reed Park.
Yeah, Griffins to Reed Park. Yeah, so that's where it all happens. It's not. Well, if you see in the segments, there's a bit around the top of the hill too. There's got to have a few bravery pills up there. Again, we were all relatively naive. Although we had a fast car, we got some 1103 brake pads, which you won't get now because they had asbestos and copper in them. But they were originally built for GTHA Falcons, so they go the distance. And what happens if you don't hammer the living daylights out of them is the copper sticks to the disc. So you end up with this massive vibration that you can't deal with. And although I'd had the word up from Peter Malloy that you hammer living daylight, don't. And I think Ronnie Gillard said to me too, he said, don't treat them softly, just treat them like you hate them. Because if you don't, they'll let you down, And Terry, obviously, I didn't pass the message on, or he didn't get it or whatever, but he went I think I did 50-something laps, 56 laps, but Terry got in and he couldn't drive it. Just the fucking brakes, terrible. I braking like crazy. So obviously either when I came in with my foot on the brake, pulled up, because you've got to come in hot. You can't walk around cooling down for 3 laps, can you? It's not the name of the game. Either that or he wasn't hammering him enough, which is, if you know Terry, that's hard to imagine. Right? He doesn't drive slowly. So my guess is when I came in with my foot in the brake to change drivers, the copper's stuck to the disc. Because I didn't have the problem he had. He couldn't drive it. We went for a while and we threw it around, but eventually pulled the plug. So, we'll give it away, which was a shame. Because Bathurst, especially in those days, you'd never know. The answer was keep going as much as anything else.
Survival of the fittest. So
I said you were screwy in one of the thingos because I got asked to do a chat at the HSRCA, and the bloke said, "Can you write down a bit of a resume of what you've done?" And I'm like,
"Oh, good God,
are you for real?" I said, "I'll give you what Crompton would describe as the rock skimming across the pond version. How's that?" And that went for like 3 pages, and the bloke came back and said, "Jesus, mate, it's not often I feel inferior, but that certainly did that to me." He said, "How old are you?" And I said, "About 150. And he said, "Yeah, it reads like that if you read all the shit you've done." I said, "That's nothing. Like it's so little." it's not funny. When I'm forced to sit down and think about it, it just goes on forever.
Yeah.
Actually, mind you, I wasn't on my own. Like, we're all flat out all the time. Like, I wasn't like a bloke running around like a blue ass fly and everybody else is standing still. Motor racing's like that, Ray. Everybody's like that. Everybody's flat out.
Probably the next major step, once you were well established by this stage of the game. We're now talking mid-80s. You moved on to crewing for the Landsvale team with Steve Reed and Trevor Ashby. Now, they were one of the top privateer teams in the Commodore world. And back in those days, touring car racing was still relatively agricultural, particularly considering you'd come from open-wheeler racing. So what was it like fitting into a proper, fairly well-funded but independent team in the touring car world?
Yeah, I think you're probably overstating a fairly well-funded thing a bit there. Hang on. I call them Ashby, Stein and Rudenheimer, right? I reckon they're Jewish, they're that type. But those guys, when I first met them, right, they had a sports sedan and they'd bought a car off Ken Matthews. He's the guy who used to import the Eldorado helmets and a lot of other stuff. Really nice guy. And he got a sick of it thing, and they had another car preparer doing the car, and they weren't happy. And they had a mechanic guy working for them who, like all these things in motor racing, I still go fishing with him now, right? In fact, I taught him to go fishing. He said, look, there's a guy over the other, because they were on the opposite side of the railway yards at Enfield of where I was. And he said, there's a guy on the other side of the railway yards, he does Formula Fords, and they're always up the front. Why don't we go and get him to do it? And I'd never met those guys, and they're like, bloody Formula Ford guy, what the hell would he know, type thing. And what people don't realise, it's a car. And yes, it's different, right? So if you muck with the roll centre on a Formula Ford, it sort of yawns, is the best way of putting it. Does it work? Yes, it does. But if you want to make it oversteer or understeer, you're mucking with the wrong bit. You with me?
Yeah.
But if you do it with a touring car, give me the rear roll centre on a touring car an inch, it pricks its ears up pretty well. You could turn it in from an understeerer to an oversteerer very easily in an inch, right? Because they're so animated, they move so much. They
in relative terms, yes.
Yes, right. So yes, the camber does the same things and the tow out does the same things and the springs do the same things, but you just need to understand by proportion. The other thing with the touring car is with the boys, we settle on a spool. You could have had any diff you wanted, but they weren't. Although they are very wealthy now, or relatively wealthy guys now, they weren't then, and they had their eyes on the prize. Motor racing wasn't to them the major thing in life. You with me?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, working for them, it was my major, but it wasn't theirs. They were busy building a business and building a life of income and so forth. So it was very annoying because mobile phones were just starting to come in, what's worse, right? So they would be off, you'd be trying to go out and have a drive at this thing and see what they thought. And they'd be off on the phone doing some sort of real estate deal or something, because they own quite a bit of property as well as a panel shop. That's a very small part of their enterprise now. The panel shop is where you see them and what people identify with them with. But they own several buildings and they're partial owners of a couple of car lease companies and a few other things like that, right? So they're quite entrepreneurial blokes, and these are blokes that started out, just like me. And in fact, not far from me. We all joke because we're all nearly the same age. I think, we're all literally within 3 months of one another in the same age. And they grew up in Bankstown. They started being panel beaters and working in the backyard on the weekend to make more money, doing big panel shop, panel work, foreign orders, if you want to call it, right, to make more money. That's how they started, and they just kept working. So when I started working with them, the motor racing thing wasn't their priority. They wanted to do well, but they would never have tipped all their money into it because they had their eyes on the prize, basically, right? Which, I admire them for. We're still, those two blokes and I are still very good friends today because we all understand one another very well, sort of thing. Like at one stage when I was working for them, another team was trying to buy me for another 30 grand. And Trevor said, I don't give a fuck, I'll match that. Like, no hesitation, Trevor. And he's known to be a tight ass, right? And I said, shit, Trevor, like, you serious? And he said, mate, what I know is I know that I can leave that racing car alone, turn up, and it'll be right. And the money that's spent will be spent right. There's no money wasted. There's no mucking around, right? He said, there's something. He said, I've got a million things on the go, which now I've sort of described to you, you'll understand where I'm coming from, which you need to know all the background. He said, I've got a million things going all the time. Well, we have got a million things going. What we know is we don't have to worry about the race car. We know that it's in very good hands and we're happy to pay whatever it costs to make it work, sort of thing. And it was very flattering at the time, you know.
Oh, it would be, definitely.
Glenn Seaton was trying to buy me, and I like Glenn. I get a good the Glenn. We're pretty similar sort of people in some ways. But Trevor was like, you know, I don't give a shit. Whatever he's offering, I'll match it and dump. I'll beat it by another 20 or 30. I said, you don't get this. It's not about money, you know. He said, no, I know what you like. You want to win races. I get it, right? He said, I can't do that for you. I know you and I know we can't do that, but I'm telling you, if it's money, I'll match it. Which, you know, for Trevor particularly, but no, Steve is not stupid with money either. They're very frugal and they're very thoughtful, analytical people about spending money, right?
Nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. In fact, like, and they're on top of that, they can still be really good blokes. Like, they're really decent people. They're not liars. They're not bullshitters. They're not frothers. They're really good, straightforward blokes. So, you know, and for various reasons, I still see them when I get a chance, you know.
Well, Wally, I think for part one of this afternoon's wonderful story, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for the time and the reminiscences that you've come up with today. It's been an absolute joy to listen to it, and I think by the time we get round to part two, our audience will be just as enthralled as I am. So thank you very much.
No problem, mate. I hope your audience does, in fact, enjoy it. Coming from my point of view, it's just another day at work, isn't it, really? But yes, I hope you enjoy it. I've enjoyed doing it because it brings back a lot of good memories. You don't think about it when you press on in life.
Well, friends, that's the conclusion of another episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast series. We hope you enjoyed the tales contained herein and look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, be sure to check out musclecarmag.com.au for news stories, news and galleries from the Muscle Car Vault. We add them weekly, as well as brand new digital issues as soon as they become available on the newsstand. Thanks for listening, and as always, safe driving and happy reading from the team at Australian Muscle Car Magazine.